And we're live. I'm here with my guest, Ryan Turnipseed. Ryan, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm happy to have you. Before we get into it, go into the audience a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? That kind of stuff.
Let me see. I'm a 19-year-old college student from Oklahoma, very non-assuming. I read a bunch of books. I play music. I listen to people. So apparently that means I know things a little bit more serious. I was very interested in things like historical theories and economic theories when I was a freshman in high school. From there, I started reading at first the Chicago School, and I had that side by side with Oswald Spengler. So it was a very interesting duo. And then I moved on to the Austrian School when I finally learned about them. Started reading things like Human Action and Man, Economy, and State. And then alongside, I was also still reading Spengler at that time, if I remember correctly, just because Decline of the West is such a monumental book. Got into a bunch of more sort of reactionary thinkers. Carlyle comes to mind, Thomas Carlyle. Kierkegaard, in some sense, can go that way as well if you read him in a certain lens, which I did. And I've just kind of gone from there. So I don't know if that explains very much.
That is great. So this episode, it made us know. Episode is called "Explaining Me Like I'm Five: The Overpopulation Myth." Because I don't know anything about this. I know a few economic stuff about it a little bit. I know who the Malthusian trap, whatever it's called, that kind of stuff. And it only came up because I was arguing with a friend of mine about Catholic natural family planning and contraceptions. And his entire when he said, well, you have to have contraceptions and your family planning is wrong because of overpopulation.
Right.
I just said overpopulation is a myth, not even know anything about it. And he literally stormed off. Like, he didn't talk to me the rest of the day. It was that crucial. His argument was overpopulation. I'm like, okay, this is apparently more involved for some people than I thought it was. It merits an episode. And so I was introduced to your episode on it. I'm like, this is a guy to talk to. Let's do it.
Wonderful. So, yeah, it is definitely in the sort of popular consciousness. Overpopulation is something that everyone talks about. Not to be too blunt, but you usually hear it from more well-off types trying to justify why they won't go the traditional family style if you're in a more rural state, because you still have to justify those things here. And then sort of in the cities, in the more coastal elite areas, you'll see them sort of chatting about it, like aristocrats would chat about the plight of the poor in ages past or something like that, where I'm sure they definitely care about that and aren't just using it for more personal means. Yes, and I'm very glad that this is how you came into contact with it, because there is a very large religious element and almost a subversive element that doesn't get talked about, because we can talk about the economics a lot, we can talk about mathematics and history, but there is a surprisingly large topic to do with churches and doctrine that just gets overlooked, because it's one of the more radical policy changes from the last 100 years. So we can start there if you want to.
Let's go right ahead. Lead the way. I have a few questions to ask along the way, but you lead the way.
So for the majority of Christian history, regardless of the denomination, you saw a very stark condemnation of contraceptive use. It was understood by just about every single Christian, Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, that having a family was a good thing, bearing children was a good thing, raising them was a good thing, etc., etc. So obviously, contraception has to be evil, regardless of just specific condemnations of contraception from church fathers, from doctrines that were still up at that point, and from various passages of Scripture. In the 1930s, however, the Anglican Communion made it licit. They legalized it, essentially. And this marks a turn for most Protestant denominations, starting with the Anglicans in the 30s, where contraception starts getting much less of condemnation, and it becomes a gray area, for quite a while. And then now in the modern day, it's almost universally accepted to be just a good thing that can be abused. A very, very sharp turnaround from the thousands of years of Christian doctrine preceding it. So you can speculate why this might have been changed. Certainly, you can look at more progressive influences in the Anglican Communion, the Episcopalians, the Church of England, and everything in the colonies. Definitely the breeding ground for progressivism at that point in time in history, and had definitely felt the brunt of it. So that can influence it, and we'll get into why that is important later. You can say that there were other spicier subversive elements that I don't find as convincing, but you'll usually hear people talking about it in sort of darker corners of the world. And then you've also just got the advent of theological liberalism for the first time actually getting a foothold in a major denomination. Because you had Universalists and you had very radical theological liberals before this, but they hadn't necessarily managed to get an explicit foothold in a denomination like the Church of England. So it's important in this regard because it completely rocked the Protestant world, at least, and I think that most other denominations are now starting to feel that because it's not just an isolated event where something happened in one denomination and it's just ignored by all the others. Usually it bleeds into the rest of them for good or ill. I know that if you compared the average Roman Catholic today to a Roman Catholic from 200 years ago, it would be very, very terrifying, the difference. Yeah. So we have that materially. So contraception, that all comes into play for overpopulation through very obvious means that most people can directly connect the logic points to, but just so that we have that foundation, the idea is population will grow geometrically. That is, an example would be starts at 2, goes to 4, goes to 8, 16, and it just keeps doubling like that. If you put that on a graph, you get basically a curved line that just goes up and towards infinity at a very quick rate. Meanwhile, the material that we can get from the Earth, usually in the Malthusian equation, it's food, but it doesn't just have to be that, as we'll talk about soon. Materials from the Earth, we can only extract at an arithmetic rate. That is, it will go 2, 4, 6, 8 on a straight line. So one of those is going to get a lot larger than the other one very quickly, the one that's constantly doubling, instead of just having 2 added to it or something similar. You can put those 2 lines on a graph, and the point at which they intersect is sort of like the Malthusian equilibrium, where that is where the population perfectly matches the resources available. And at any point past that, you get a Malthusian collapse, where the lack of resources available to the population necessarily must mean that the population has to collapse or die prematurely down to that sort of equilibrium point. So contraception, as we just talked about, comes into play because it is a natural limiter of population without bringing about premature death. If you take a very modern view of life and population, so you have that to consider. You have the historical view to consider. Malthus was writing all of these. Was writing this in, I believe, 1798. So this was right at the tail end of the of sort of the French colonial period, going right into the Revolution. They had multiple empires, but this is where they completely lost most of their rich colonies. They lost previously colonies in India, colonies across the world in the Indies, not to be confused with India, and they were about to lose Louisiana and eventually Haiti. France was in turmoil. Their food production was suffering. They had a very terrible harvest that year, if I remember correctly, which you might read about learning about the French Revolution. Bad harvests, food prices increasing, and then a almost simulated famine leading to discontent, usually often is cited as a cause. So Malthus writes his theory. Whether it's in relation to this explicitly or not, I don't quite remember. I don't think that's necessarily been established. But it does get picked up quite quickly, not only by the English where he was writing, but also by the French. So you have the French revolutionaries taking a very Malthusian view of population, food consumption, claiming that certain populations will eventually just have to die, therefore justifying any killings that the revolutionaries needed to do. So this theory, I don't know if I'm not. I don't know if I'm being too on the nose. It's used to justify population control, and if the theory is correct, which we'll go into why it's not, it has a point. You know, you might as well. People are going to die, so prevent them from being born or kill off the ones you don't want, which sounds terrible. But if you take if you take it to be true, that's your only conclusions, basically, or just let the collapse happen naturally, which usually gets made out to be a sort of apocalyptic scenario. Following so far? I don't want to.
I'm absolutely following. I'm taking notes.
Alrighty. So we have all of that. The revolutionaries will use this to kill off royalists, basically, more conservative areas of France, political dissidents, starve out people. It gets used to a very full extent. The classic historical example of Malthus's ideas being put into practice is in Ireland, where the British blockade the island of Ireland to some degree, limiting food imports because when the famine struck, basically when one harvest went bad, the elites took that opportunity to basically make the point. Well, this is going to happen anyways. We're not going to have enough food to support the population in Ireland. It's going to collapse. We might as well get this over with now instead of dragging it out. Which is why you get very insane statistics about most parts of the world untouched by Malthus's theory, giving money to the Irish to donate to help. Meanwhile, most of the UK, including the royal family, doesn't. Just completely ignores it. This is why. Because Malthus' theory that population growth will exceed food production, material production, earthly production. This is what it leads to. And I can't necessarily say that the logic is wrong if you accept that foundation.
Yeah.
We see this again in the Americas once it spreads to the United States in the progressive movement. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a very major Supreme Court figure. He is the one that we have to thank for if I remember correctly, for the clear and present danger doctrine, which is an extremely restrictive force upon things like speech. It was used also to detain people in wartime. So this is a kind of figure we're dealing with. He also uses this and some of the other progressives on the court in order to legalize sterilization of undesirables in the United States. Not quite in that language, but that is what it ends up being. Basically the poor, whereas in other places so far it was ideological leanings or geographical or nationalistic leanings, Ireland. In the United States, it was typically the poor that was seen as the undesirables that should not be reproducing. That is, if we're going to have this Malthusian collapse, we want to make sure that it's not the lower classes in squalor that end up taking over the world. We want it to be everyone else not in squalor. And of course, with the progressives, there was always a racial element. If you don't know your history about the progressive movement in the United States, there's a very good Rothbard piece on it called The Progressive Era, among others. But
great book.
So there was always a very strong racial element associated with the progressives. Usually it gets pulled out as a point of slander, but I think that's intellectually lazy. I'm just mentioning this as a point of fact. They are the ones that revived the Klan in the 1920s. They're the ones that push for federal segregation, things along those lines. On the state level, certainly they segregated a lot of states. So there was also a racial element, though I would argue it wasn't as strong as the class element to eugenics, basically, when it comes to this population control. So we've talked about what the basic theory is, who has used it before in history, and some of the effects that it's had. For instance, the population of Ireland still hasn't recovered today, which gets thrown out in pop history all the time. The French, the royalists, Also, I think there were some regions that never really recovered their sort of ideological consolidation. So you'd have regions of France that were extremely royalist, some that were extremely revolutionary. Through the mass murders carried out by the revolutionaries, they ended up basically wiping out entire royalist and therefore conservative strongholds that never came back. And then in the United States, we've seen certain communities, poor, black, I'm sure there are a few others, but those are the two main ones, that have not recovered from progressive policies targeting them. Although the policies change after a while, it's not just the eugenics and sterilization and population control that the progressives pushed. These are the effects. These are the kinds of people that took it up. We talked about the Church of England. But was the theory actually correct? We haven't discussed that yet.
That's what I'm asking next. What are the fallacies involved, and why is the theory wrong?
So I'm going to go historically because it's one of my favorite sort of things to point out. When Malthus was writing this, 1798, North America was not yet a major food producer like we have today, where we have the entire Great Plains region as one of the major bread baskets of the world. It was just the East Coast that was mostly habitable. The Great Plains, parts of the Midwest, were basically seen as wastelands. And the reason was because the soil was too terrible. It was unplowable with iron plows, that it was almost unfarmable. So you just had all those prairies out there, little water, unless you were next to a river or something like that, which is not most of the Great Plains if you've seen a map or been out there, constantly in a drought. So it was seen as a wasteland. Thomas Malthus writes this based off of current trajectories at the time. And then almost immediately after he dies, I think in the 1830s, so there's like a 30-year period after he writes this where he's still kicking and writing and promoting his ideas. Basically, almost after he dies, the steel plow gets introduced to the United States, which allows those Great Plains and those wastelands to be turned into very, very valuable farmland. Being as the steel plow is able to actually cultivate fields, unlike the iron plow. If I remember correctly, and I'm not a farmer, so don't quote me on this, I think it was something like dirt would stick to the iron plow and basically make it unusable, like in the form of any working machine, whereas the steel plow, it didn't do such a thing, so you could plow it like a normal field, if I remember correctly. So that happens. We also get advents of technology throughout that century, like refrigeration. We get better preserving standards. We get modern medicine, all things that help people live, all things that help preserve food, that help output more food. So suddenly, what we can get from the earth no longer seems as arithmetic and standard. It suddenly far out exceeds the population that we have and the growth as well. And what we start seeing from those effects, and this is all empirically, we'll get into the logical fallacies very soon, I promise. What you start seeing from those effects that you might see in modern development theory is that very wealthy regions of the earth now that don't have to worry about food security start having less and less children. Even before contraception, the average family size was much lower than parts of the world that did have to deal with food insecurity. So, industrial Britain, if I remember correctly, the average family size was declining, while most of China, for instance, where you could still very much have famines, was not. Their family size was just as it had been for most of their history, bar periods of strife and war. So you get that development that Malthus just didn't predict. So in this sense, he was treating humans kind of as unthinking animals that will just completely outstrip their environment and just don't adapt, if you can call having a smaller family or less children adapting, which I'm sure we can get into very soon. Logically, where did Malthus go wrong in saying that, our material is only ever going to grow at an arithmetic rate and the population's only ever going to grow at a geometric rate? Well, this completely discounts things like innovation or technology and ingenuity. So by treating man as just a standardized animal that he can put its production and its growth on a map, or on a graph rather, he completely discounts one of the main things that separates man from animal, which is reason. which I'm sure there are some people that will dispute the extent of that. But we are certainly the only animal that can innovate to the extent that we can see. So that is to say, we're the only animal that can produce things like refrigerators, computers, and all these other things. That's one. There's also the economic fallacy, which says that our resources are set and there's no getting any more of them. So us Austrians, through our theory, can very easily see that one object can have many different uses, which means as a resource, it has different. It can be seen as different resources, even though it's the same object, if you will. So one object can satisfy multiple different ones. Malthus and most people at the time in England, to be fair, wouldn't see it that way. You have a set amount of resources that can only be used in these ways, and we can mathematize that, put it on a graph, and we can measure how much of this resource we have for what we need. This is insane to us for the reasons that I just described. Also, you have the changing wants of people. So diet and caloric intake can change. If I remember correctly from the pamphlet not the pamphlet, but the paper that he wrote, the treatise, I don't believe he actually took that into account, but it has been a couple of years. And forgive me for being imprecise on Malthus himself. The reason I'm not necessarily being as strict on him is because his whole theory doesn't get taken as dogma, just the sort of foundational principles. So Malthus himself, he formulated the ideas in very precise terms. I mean, he made the graph, but it doesn't actually get used as such. Just the underlying mimetic ideas that population growth is going to outstrip resources, and that's just what pervades. So those groups that we talked about, the progressives, and we'll get to a few other ones in the modern day, they don't necessarily take Malthus's original ideas, but they take the underlying idea that population will exceed resource production. So we have all that's Malthus, I think, wrapped up. I don't think I've missed anything necessarily.
Seemed like you covered him pretty well. I mean, I sorry, the cat's going nuts. You seem to cover him pretty well. So one of my next questions, then, I guess, is going to be how do I put this? I'm sorry. I completely lost my train of thought. Sorry, guys. It was a long day at work, and the sun really got to me. I'm having
that's fine.
So currently, you mentioned the God, I cannot get my thought again. Okay, I got it. You mentioned how there was change in technology, things of multiple uses. It's not a what was the word you used? It was counting. You talked about it was the uses that were being used. What was the word you used? It was the arrow something. It was counting up. God, okay. It was going 2, 4. It was counting.
So arithmetic.
Arithmetic.
Resource materials are growing at an arithmetic rate. Yeah.
Is there a cap on it? Is there eventually a cap where it kind of just goes, okay, we've exhausted all resources, we've exhausted technological implementation? Is there an event? Because it's not what I've heard from some overpopulation argument friends. There's eventually going to be a cap on how much production can be done. We're eventually going to run out. It's no avoiding that because it's a finite Earth. Is there any legitimacy to that argument?
This is where Malthus gets modernized, because originally he wasn't necessarily concerned about the end state. To him, that equilibrium point where resource production and population intersected was all that mattered. You're not going to get to the end because you're always just going to be in that constant state of collapse that was supposed to come very soon after his lifetime, which didn't. But we get this theory sort of updated. When that collapse doesn't happen, and when you still have all these different groups that are very interested in the theory for one reason or another, we can take them at their word, or we can assume malintentions, social engineering, control, genocidal wants from some groups. They can't rely on the Malthusian collapse whenever basically we're producing food at record levels in all of human history, and we're in a state of food security that's never before been seen. That collapse isn't going to scare anyone, and it's most certainly not coming, and it's not true. So what happens? Well, the theory gets modernized to start talking about the total amount of resources. Because now that we don't have to worry about the short term, we have to worry about the far, far long term, where we've completely exhausted the earth of all of its material wealth. And what are we going to do then down the line? Who knows how far away that's going to be? It doesn't matter. We have to basically preserve our future. Well, this gets popularized very recently, I would say, by sort of originally the Club of Rome, which they published a paper or a book or report, something along those lines. I don't know what the technical name for the document would be. The title of which was The Limits to Growth, published in 1972, if I remember correctly. So what you have is a bunch of elites gathering from all across the Western world, and I think parts of the undeveloped world at the time. And what they were discussing was what's going to happen to the world with sort of a neo-Malthusian lens. So it's very similar. They will use graphs and they will chart things and their intersections. Malthus, very basic comparatively, he just charted resource production and population growth. The Club of Rome is going to chart population growth, resource production, resource use, and they're also going to chart things like CO2 output, prevalence of contraception, or they have some sort of measurement that they use. I forget. Once again, you can check out the document, The Limit to Growth. They basically add together as sort of a factor or an amplifier, a multiplier. Education for women in the workforce, contraception, all things that will limit population growth to actually multiply population growth by in their mathematical equations. And they run the simulation multiple times because at this point we have computers. It's not just hand calculations that Malthus was using a couple hundred years ago. And what they end up finding, surprise, surprise, is that if we just use more contraception and if we switch to less carbon outputting energy sources and industries, we can sustain population for longer without having to completely destroy the earth or without having to go into a neo-Malthusian collapse, which for the neo-Malthusians, the sort of people that took Malthus's original idea and modified it, this collapse looks much like a sort of environmentalist dystopia that you might read about in, I believe it's like The Sheep Lookup, I think that's the book, where you have masses and masses of people in a very sort of smog-filled world where there's just no resources left. Everything is expensive. People are starving.
Sounds like LA.
Well, yeah. So yeah, there's a joke to be made there about them inducing this, obviously. But this is sort of the collapse they're predicting. It's not going to be warfare over limited resources like it would have been in more classically minded Malthusian documents. It's just going to be, squalor and hell for most people. And of course, the way that you solve this is just by adopting their agenda.
Of course,
to be less partial towards one side or the other. Instead of advocating for killing people, like we saw with the old Malthusians, the revolutionaries and the progressives and the sterilizations, they're just advocating for constricting population growth, hence the name, the limit to growth. By all these other means, and then also for some reason pushing a very sort of progressive policy on most of society. So obviously you and I, we don't have to be completely impartial. We can see this for what it is. It's a complete agenda being pushed on most of the West, and in fact it's come to fruition basically. Because in the 70s you still had most of the West above replacement rate for its families, despite the fact that it had reached that sort of post-industrialization point in their development, where people suddenly have less children. They were still above replacement rate. When the Club of Rome starts pushing these policies on the West, suddenly the fertility rate drops below 2.1 per family. So they got exactly what they wanted, but somehow they can release papers in 2008, 2009 saying we still haven't solved it. We have to do more to the West and also now the undeveloped world. So hold on one second. My voice is about to give out.
It's all good. So yes, it's one. It sounds like another one of those never impossible to achieve goals at state levels of person keep pushing more power.
So
climate change, overpopulation, equality. This is another one of those examples.
Yes, it is. And so this is all being calculated. Sorry.
It's all good. Sorry, please continue. My cat was meowing at the door. I went to pick him up, and he hides under the bed when I don't know he's here, and he just comes out every time I'm recording. He just pops out of nowhere and just wants to interrupt.
Yeah, cats. Anyways, so it is definitely an unreachable goal. Also, all of their things are unfalsifiable. So typically, you can prove any scientific theory wrong either by trial and error, will this come to fruition, or by logic. You can't prove any of this wrong. And we economists can see, or we Austrians at the very least, can see why, because they ran all these through mathematical equations. Well, obviously, if you tweak the mathematical equations to give you exactly what you want, then you're not going to necessarily be able to prove it wrong unless you accept all of their presuppositions. And their presuppositions are axioms, basically. Let me know if you can prove correct or incorrect an axiom. So this is sort of what you're dealing with. It's passed off as science because it looks very scientific. It's made by scientists. The methodology looks very scientific. It has math, it has graphs, and it has a very sort of scientific language. But you can't falsify this, much like you can't with climate change. Especially not in this generation. I'm sure generations from now can look back empirically, which, once again, gray area, as we might know, for human behavior. I'm sure generations coming after us can look back at all these things and say, well, this didn't come to be. But then all that we see from the people pushing this is they moved the goalposts completely. Well, of course that didn't come to be. This was incorrect in the equation originally, and we've added this new thing that needs to happen in these countries now, which is what they did with the limit to growth. So we can get into growth as a concept and things like that, because obviously most people, most politicians, and other NGOs, similar to the Club of Rome, do not like the GDP falling, which the Club of Rome was explicitly advocating for, and into economic growth in sort of the classical sense. There are other people that don't quite like that, and so we implemented what the Club of Rome desired. We put women into the workforce. We gave out a lot of education grants to educate everyone. We started implementing contraceptive programs. It's available like it never has been in human history before. We also started providing childcare and all this other stuff so that women can work longer. So fertility rates have completely collapsed, and I'm sure there's also other things. Microplastics is a thing you hear about, and all these other health hazards. I don't know as much about those. I only know the more social side of this. We've implemented everything that the Club of Rome asked for, but that hasn't satisfied everyone. So now that the West's fertility levels have completely collapsed and their population is looking like it's about to decline, what do? We let in the third world. We import people to make up for the people that we no longer have by the native population in order to make sure that the GDP doesn't fall, and make sure that these social welfare schemes like Social Security that rely on a larger generation to come after the current one, to make sure that these don't collapse. So that's not the Club of Rome's doing, and that's not the Malthusians doing. That's their competitors or their comrades. I don't know. It depends on how you look at it. It's the doings of other NGOs in tandem with Malthusian population controls, which is where we are today, the intersection of all those groups.
That was a lot of information. Great job, by the way. It was really interesting. There was a lot I learned a lot on that. This is a question I was asked. People wanted me to ask you. How does abortion, or you mentioned contraceptions, how does things like abortion, encouraging for less pushing anti-family values, literally telling single mothers you don't get married, you have more money. How do these kind of things play into that? They all kind of feed into the same overpopulation thing, or how does it?
Right. So overpopulation as we can probably gauge from the elites pushing this, they don't necessarily have to believe in it. There's a much more compelling argument to be made that they just want this for social control. I mean, the Club of Rome was founded by, Rockefellers, for instance. They aren't necessarily seen as the most genuine people, but that's a character attack, so I'll avoid that for the sake of intellectual honesty for now. And just point out that there are more incentives than just out of the goodness of their hearts, the elites worrying about overpopulation. The overpopulation is more for the plebeians to worry about. So you, I, and all the other commoners that we know that aren't the elites making policy, that's what you and I have to worry about is overpopulation, because this incentivizes people to not have children to avoid that neo-Malthusian collapse.
I literally know people who don't want to have kids because of overpopulation.
Right. Yeah. It works.
Weird. It's weird.
Yeah.
It works, and it's weird that it's honestly weird that it does work. I think that probably points more to the scientism and the mathematics of everyone's focused on it's science, therefore it's true.
Right, and it completely contradicts things like natural law, which is the most infuriating thing for any sort of classical Christian, is just watching people completely go against their very obvious nature, or numbers on a paper that can't be proven or falsified. So, anyways, overpopulation, probably not what the people at the top are worried about, but it's certainly what they will educate you in schools, put on the television, put on the radio, and start telling the younger generations about. As for things like abortion, it is absolutely the case that is being used. And in fact, that was, if I remember correctly, the earliest form of contraception, was to simply kill the child. So, the early church fathers, when they were writing about contraception, that is what they were dealing with, was people ingesting, I believe it was flowers, in sort of the Mediterranean region that would just kill the fetus. Forgive me, I completely forget the church father that wrote against it primarily, but that was exactly what it was abortion originally. And that didn't go away. There's sort of the... give me a second.
It's all good. Take your time.
There's sort of the mainstream conservative meme that Planned Parenthood was founded for eugenicist purposes, and that is entirely correct. Some of us have probably heard it enough times to be sick of hearing about the idea, but that is entirely true. Originally, it is worth noting they did not perform abortion, but they were just to sort of promote these eugenicist policies and family planning, all these other things that you can, contraceptive use, things that can limit population without resorting to abortion. But with the legalization of abortion in some states and then the federal legalization by court, they do very much start making that their main source of contraception, at least that we can measure. It's very hard to measure how effective contraception is by numbers, except for abortion, because the numbers are already there beforehand. You don't see what you could have had. So abortion is absolutely used, and it was in history. And in fact, there is arguments to be made that it was a wide and common practice in the late Roman Republic and early Roman Empire, because we had Emperor Augustus pass multiple laws penalizing elderly bachelors, families that didn't have children. There's evidence that there was a sort of demographic decline and collapse in the late Roman Republic, early Roman Empire, simply looking at the laws that were being passed. There were a few other things as well. I think they limited bathhouses and all these other things because it was basically seen as not only cultural libertinism, but it was also correlated with people just not having children. It was sort of seen as decadence. And I'm sure there might be a scientific reason for that the Romans might not have known, but might have been onto something. So you have that in ancient history. There have been demographic declines throughout history since then. You had the original Romans themselves kind of get overtaken in the Italian peninsula by the Germans in the north, if I remember correctly. The Lombards supplant the old Roman citizenry with the Lombards, a mix of Italian and German. Same with other parts of the Roman Empire. though some of those were more genocidal than they were longer-term contraceptive-induced collapses and all these other methods that don't just involve directly killing the population. And then, of course, you have the modern West, where the average family is below replacement rate. You have ideas that are not entirely new to history, but certainly in the ways that to the extent that we have applied them, are new, such as the 2-income, no children families that you see running around. Families, couples might be a more apt description. So you do have this. You do have things like this being seen in the Roman Empire, where you would have couples that would reach their elderly years without having children. But it was mocked and it was legislated against. Certainly not something that we have right now, unless maybe you could count Hungary. But even then, I don't know if the numbers are necessarily reflecting success there. I certainly think we're in one of the more extreme demographic crises, though.
Yeah. There seems to be a lot of overlap between overpopulation, climate change. It seems like a lot of the left's favorite narratives of push seem to overlap a lot with each other, and they all kind of feed into each other. I wouldn't have a question about that. It's an observation. You have anything to add about that kind of like? There seems to really be a connection between these things.
Yes. So if you go read that Limit to Growth from the Club of Rome, they will directly mention CO2 output, climate change, and all these other issues bringing about the neo-Malthusian collapse. And if you listen to your current modern environmental movement, the Greens that are completely in favor of destroying a country's energy industry, food production, and their agricultural industry, and basically just saying people will die, but that's just the price that I'm willing to pay. Those types of environmentalists, you can see that they most definitely believe at the same time in overpopulation being a major issue and also in climate change being a main issue. And then overpopulation feeds into climate change as well, if you want to make that your main point of view. So overpopulation brings about more CO2 production, and then more CO2 production destroys more of the planet, destroys more natural resources, harms other ecosystems, etc., etc. Therefore, we need to limit human population. So both of these, you are very correct, feed into each other. And you can also add in other issues. Large corporations usually get thrown into the mix here. Usually they'll say, oh, well, they produce a disproportionate amount of CO2, therefore we have to destroy the larger corporations. In my experience, this line of reasoning has sort of fallen out of popularity. You don't usually see that one as much. Usually it's more on the overpopulation now. But I remember coming across that when I was still in school. They would sort of throw that around as like, this is also a talking point being thrown around. So basically everything that the left, coincidentally or not, I'll let you decide, wants to go against, ends up being put into one of these narratives. So with overpopulation, they most certainly mainly targeted the West. With climate change, once again, they have targeted the West. Overpopulation sort of gets multiple things. So not only did they get the West, as I just said, they also use it to attack things like the church. So certainly any institution that still prohibits contraception is seen as a very restrictive and medieval institution. Medieval being a slur to these people. So
not the dream,
So they use it as a hammer against traditional institutions. They use it as a hammer against traditional families. So there are some more environmentally minded overpopulation enthusiasts that will write against the nuclear family, that will write against traditional societal organization around the nuclear family, because that historically produces large amounts of children. And you also see this being attacked for racism, for all the other leftist reasons that you would attack something traditional. You are right; they all intersect.
How does the philosophy of antinatalism have any role in this kind of the myth of overpopulation?
Yeah. So some overpopulation is centered on future generations. I think that would be sort of the older generations, the ones that you would see at these sort of forums that have gray hair, look a bit old. The last generation of environmentalists that were pushing this. The newer ones that you and I will see most often will push this sort of as a anti-humanity stance. They aren't worried about future generations, and they aren't necessarily worried about the future of the Earth or something like that. It's more of an embedded nihilism. So I can see this as a Zoomer. A lot of people in my generation just really hate humanity. They hate children. They hate families. They don't want families. They don't want children. And so if whether it's because they reach that position because of overpopulation and because they're just genuine believers, or if the theory just provided a convenient excuse to believe all of that, that is what they adopt most often. It is very anti-human, which I think that there's a lot that C.S. Lewis wrote about that specific topic. Though I don't think he could have necessarily predicted the extent to which we see it today. Antinatalism that you do see, have less children for whatever reason, sort of as its own end goal. Once again, feeds into all the other things that we just discussed. But it's much more nihilistic. Yeah. Every time that you and I hear about have less children, they don't usually say what the end goal is. It is just have less children and you can have these benefits, or for this cause or something like that. But they don't say what the end goal of the cause is even then. You only see this antinatalism pushed in the West, where the Club of Rome has had its complete heyday, where every single policy that they pushed for has been enacted. It's the next step. You don't get to hear any sort of fanciful notions about preserving the earth for future generations, or making sure that our children can live on, or making sure that the green trees still bloom here. It's just have less children, and then eventually we can phase humanity out. That's what you face.
I don't get how anybody holds it as like a legit philosophy. Like I got into a few disagreements with some anti-natalists on Twitter maybe a few weeks ago, and one of them said, "You're wasting your time. He's a Catholic." The notorious breeders, and I put notorious breeder in my bio. Like, what's that? Notorious breeder. That's going. Yeah, the unmarried Catholic is a notorious breeder.
Yeah,
it was the dumbest thing I've ever read. I'm like, I don't know how to interact with these kind of people. Like, how are you that nihilistic about humanity as a whole? We have to wipe off. We send them to these more. It's insane.
Right, and there's a plethora of explanations for why they might be anti-humanity. You get sort of the spiteful mutants idea from the more Duttonite types, Edward Dutton. You get people saying that they're just, demon possessed, which, seems more and more plausible as they say more. And then you just get people very naively saying, well, they actually believe this and we have to convince them. But the issue with this sort of nihilism being pushed is it is very hard to argue a nihilist out of nihilism. Not impossible, but for the purpose of practicality, it's very difficult. You try to convince someone of having meaning. It's almost impossible. They either have to experience something sort of like as a shock factor, or they never get it, which is why this particular idea is so insidious and why it's such a problem. It's being pushed in schools. You get a bunch of schools that will take a very, very nihilistically environmentalist view about things. If I remember correctly, I think that the biology class that I was in talked about overpopulation a lot. AP biology. Cool. So, it's not like a one-off thing. This was the biology class, and it was the teacher sort of helping the other science teachers know what to teach. And I'm sure that they don't necessarily need the help just because of the way the school system is now. This stuff is taught in schools. It's probably now being taught at a very young age. I remember coming across like 12 and 13-year-olds talking about overpopulation. If you go onto YouTube, you can see pop science videos on most platforms talking about overpopulation. They have very high production quality. I'm sure that they get absolutely no money from these organizations trying to push it. But their main audience target is people that look at infographics. So bored people, which is a lot of the West, people that just get caught by flashy colors and want a dopamine hit, most of the West.
Sounds like Zoomers.
Yeah, and Zoomers.
Like a lot of Zoomers.
Yeah, the young generation see something flashy, might be curious still at this point in time, and they just start reading about overpopulation. It sounds very fancy. It's almost a very edgy take because it's anti-humanity. Can you go farther than that and just disliking everything around you? So it just gets adopted wholesale by my generation. And we're going to see the consequences when you get a generation of nihilists raised. It's happened before in history, and it never ends well.
Yeah, no, my generation. I'm a Gen Z too. I'm 23, and it's the talking to people my age about anything of meaning, and it is just nothing but nihilism and like how to put this. It seemed like the position is just anti-natural law, but they didn't even know what natural law is.
Right.
And there's the anti-teleology, the anti-all that stuff, and it's really just like you explain to them natural law, like, well, that makes no sense. I'm like, what do you mean makes no sense? And they have the weirdest objections. It makes no sense. I can't.
Right.
So people.
The whole natural fallacy idea that this is what it's like in nature, and therefore that doesn't mean anything, and it's just coincidental, is meant to attack natural law. Because natural law hinges almost entirely on the purpose of things as they are. Why should man and woman have children? Well, natural law says because that is what they are. That's what they are built to do. Very obviously, you see it everywhere. You see it across history. You see it in nature, and you can deduce that on your own without even having to see it empirically. So, natural law states man and woman should have children. Why shouldn't man and woman therefore have an abortion? Because that doesn't happen. You don't have anything. You have to induce it very violently at the risk of harming, the carrier, the woman. So natural law completely goes against most modern sensibilities because it is natural, and modern sensibility hates everything that is natural in that regard. So if you try saying these things, these very, very well understood concepts for hundreds and hundreds of years, you'll just get thrown at you. Well, that's the natural fallacy. Just because it happens in nature doesn't mean we need to do it. Yeah. Well, if they had any sort of concept of morality, perhaps then that wouldn't be as strong of an objection. Mm-hmm. But you're dealing with a generation of people that were largely raised amorally. There is no one morality that pervades people, if there even is one at all. Sometimes you can come across people that have a concept of good and evil. Most of the time, it's just, oh, well, that depends on your perspective, being the main moral arbiter. So natural law is, by practicality, meaningless to these people, even though they are going against it, and it is very real. There are going to be consequences.
Yeah. Well, we only got 8 minutes left in the episode. Yeah, any final thoughts or anything you want to impart onto the audience about the overpopulation mess?
Right. So when you come across it in your day-to-day life, it's probably not going to be very convincing to just start spouting off, well, Malthus was wrong because this and this reason, and then it was used by the neo. You're going to look like the guy that has the cork board with the red lines in the background.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do that. It is probably going to be more fruitful if you do get into an argument with these people to talk about, underlying morality. It's never a terrible idea to start at first principles, just because there you can gauge, is it worth discussing things with this person, which can be difficult because sometimes you can have friends that just are completely amoral.
The amount of people who want to, I have friends who want to argue with me about gay marriage, trans rights, all this kind of stuff. And I say, well, let's start at the beginning. I believe God is real. And they're like, no, I don't want to talk about that. I'm like, you want to argue all these things down the line, but you won't let me even defend or talk about my first principle on this thing. And you're going to say I'm wrong. It's a waste of time. If you can't argue first principle with these people, I don't see a reason to really engage.
Right. And here's the other thing as well. The other sort of counter to all this is you get people saying, well, this just sorts itself out. They won't have children, they won't reproduce, and they lose in the end, and we win. And it has, convincing logic there. I would caution against that, though, because that's not how these ideas spread. They weren't inherited. A lot of these eugenicists, Malthusians, and progressives weren't always raised in Malthusian and progressive households. Usually they adopted these views. So if you want to really win in the end, have a family, have a large family like you would have at any other time in human history, and make sure that you educate your children well. That's the main thing. Have a very airtight household, a very well-educated Christian household that can actually impart these things and make sure that your family is defended.
You heard it here first, guys. Ryan Turnipseed, go get married. Well, this has been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for coming on, Ryan. What are your plugs? Where can people find you at?
So I might as well advertise this. So not only can you find me there, but you can also find a lot of other good people there as well. Findmyfriends.net, if I remember correctly. Let me just double check that. Yes, so that is FINDMYFRENS.net. You can find me there, and you can find a lot of my friends there. More specifically, I have a YouTube channel, Ryan Turnipseed. You can also find my videos on Odyssey. And I co-host with Stephen Carson at his YouTube channel, Radical Liberation, where we have covered the Malthusians before. I think this is a much cleaner presentation, though, because I think I'm a much more put-together presenter now than I was then. So those are the places you're most likely to find me, and Twitter, under my name there as well. So
wonderful. Well, guys, this is an episode of Faith, Liberty, and Praxis, Season 2, Episode 3. Thank you so much for watching. Get married and have kids.